Right here at the beginning of the story, Ruth is 4 chapters long. This is the first chapter, the first part of the story. And right in the beginning, Ruth, our main character, is faced with a terrible decision. Alone and desperate, she is having to decide whether to continue on with her mother-in-law, to go to this new land, or to return to her people, but where there is a famine. Neither good choices. I was thinking about this and about the weight of that decision because I can't imagine, partly because of my place of privilege in the life that I've lived, I can't imagine making a decision like that. And partly just because I don't feel like I'm great at making decisions. And maybe you feel that way sometimes too. Just this week, I have struggled to know what to order on a breakfast menu at the Wooden Shoe. It took me a while. I had to ask the waitress to come back a couple times. I've been frustrated over whether the color of a light switch in my house was slightly off from the color of the rest of them in the house. I have worried whether I had time to cook the whole chicken in our oven or the enchiladas for dinner. Just this morning, I realized I'd forgotten to wear my t-shirt, my new Calvary t-shirt, and then I agonized over that decision for about 5 to 10 minutes. Of whether I should go and put one on or not. But Ruth is deciding whether to leave her homeland and her people. And when this story begins, she's desperate. She's lost her husband. She's lost food and family, so she's desperate. She's hungry. Her main realities at that point, the narrative of her life, is disappointment, famine, and death. But they've heard about this place, Judah, that still has food and where the harvest is still happening. And so she'll do anything to go, even leave her homeland and her family behind. She will risk everything for another chance at life and a chance to help her mother-in-law, who is broken in body and spirit, bitter, as she says. And so they set out together, Naomi and Ruth, to the land of Judah. They're barely alive, but they are clinging to each other, arm in arm. If you wonder about the depth of devotion that Ruth has shared to Naomi, think about the simple fact that it says Ruth clung to Naomi. It echoes these same words in Hebrew, as a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. They were family. They were kin. She was not about to let go, and so they walk arm in arm into an uncertain future. And that's the tension that we feel here at the end of chapter 1. What is going to happen to them? Will they find food? Will they be accepted there? Will she find refuge? Will she be welcomed with hospitality? Will anyone notice her, really her, Ruth, her hard work, her loyalty, her courage, her potential? The potential not just to be the foreigner, but to be family. It's no coincidence that I think that the city that they're going to is Bethlehem, for many reasons. One of which is that in Hebrew, the word Bethlehem means house of bread. And they show up when? They happen to just arrive at the start of the barley harvest. It's a hint that things may be working out for them. Some other forces are at work providing for them and guiding them. But the question remains at the end of chapter 1, will the people of God in Judah be a place of refuge for her? Will it truly be a house of bread? Or will they respond as we are often tempted to respond when people come into our midst? She's too different. She'll be a burden, right? She comes with too much baggage, or she doesn't look like us, or act like us, or talk like us. What will she find, Calvary? What will she find when she arrives in our midst, in our neighborhood, in our workplace, in our sanctuary? You know how her story begins here. The question is, how will her story end? I cannot read about the story of Ruth at this particular time in our world history when we are facing a huge refugee crisis. Depending on how you count it, 65 or 70 million people. It's such a big number, you can't even wrap your head around it. It's like a quarter of the United States is just suddenly forcibly displaced from their homes and cannot go back. Think of entire states: California, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. Everybody. What brought it home for me in a lot of ways was hearing a story from where I grew up, on the east side of the state. There's groups of people who have come over as immigrants, and one of the groups that has come over as refugees over the past few decades are Chaldean Christians. Chaldeans are mostly folks who have grown up in or lived in Iraq, a people group, and they're mostly Christians. There was a man this summer whose name was Jimmy Al-Daoud, and in 1979, he was born in Greece in a refugee camp, even though his parents were Iraqi. And he came to the U.S., they came to the U.S. as refugees legally when he was 6 months old. But Jimmy struggled throughout his life with mental illness. He got in trouble with the law and was spent time in jail, in and out. And so on June 2nd, he was deported back to Iraq. I say back to, but he had never been there before. It was under a sweep of folks that were deported. You may have read about it because it made a lot of Michigan news anyway. There were several hundred, maybe even 1,000 folks who were Chaldeans who were sent back to Iraq. When he was sent back, he had a little bit of insulin for his diabetes, no money, and did not speak Arabic. And he died on August 6th in Iraq because he ran out of insulin, despite a bipartisan effort request to stop those particular folks, the Chaldeans, from being deported back to Iraq. Our country in the United States has admitted 200,000 to 27,000, huge ranges of numbers since 1980, numbers of refugees. It hit its lowest point, 27,000, right after September 11th, when there was a lot of fear and new processes of vetting. It went back up to 85,000, and next year the cap is at 18,000. 70 million people and 18,000. In this area, there's a history of refugees coming in, mostly through Bethany Christian Services. There have been children who have come in as unaccompanied minors and have found homes here in West Michigan. Back a couple decades ago, it was many people from Laos and a few in the past few years from Afghanistan. Cities like Houston and Minneapolis that are growing leaps and bounds have huge populations of folks who have come over as immigrants. That's our current reality, and what runs through my head as I read the story of Ruth traveling and making those same decisions to leave country and homeland, to leave security of family. How does Ruth's story end? It ends like a happy ending out of a fairy tale almost. It's beautiful. And why is that? It ends because God's people live as God's people. Ruth is celebrated at the end of chapter 4 as worth more than 7 sons, which in that culture is an unbelievable thing to say or to hear. She gives birth to a child, to a man named Boaz that she marries, a man who is godly and good and who does the right thing. He gives Ruth and Naomi the protection that they need in that time, in that strange place. In Naomi, we end with the scene of Naomi holding that grandchild and no longer filled with the bitterness that she felt, being redeemed, and the community surrounds her and honors her. It reads like this. It says, Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, now at last Naomi has a son again. One scholar that I read had a beautiful phrase for this. It said, this story is a memory of the future. Meaning that it is a story told about the memory of Israel in the distant past, but the reason we tell it, the reason God needs it in our scriptures is because it actually is pointing us to where we need to go. Right? That's why we tell the story of Ruth and why it is part of our story. Because in the end, there is continuing sustenance for people, for all who are in need. The old are cared for and honored, as Naomi is. The foreigner is welcomed. The privileged, Boaz, goes above and beyond the expectations and normal constraints of society. Everything that is done with joy and decently in order, and there is respect for both genders. Men and women are celebrated at the end for their place in the community. Wow, you think about all those things and you think, this is an incredible picture. This is a picture of the heroics of daily faithfulness, of when Ruth, starting with Ruth in many ways, when she was faced with that decision, stay or go, she has that decision to make, and all throughout the book of Ruth, an amazing thing happens. People make good decisions. How different this is, right, from the narratives that we like to tell or like movies we like to watch. We're obsessed with the anti-hero or with things that just constantly go wrong all the time. And this is a story, I think, that just is really refreshing to me because you read through it and you're like, everybody's trying to be good. They're trying to do the right thing, and mostly they do. And God honors that. What an incredible thing. They're not exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. And in fact, many commentators have noted there's not really what we would call a miracle in this story. It's just people going about their business trying to do what God has asked them and called them to do. So this is not a story of extraordinary heroics, but of simple faithfulness in all things and at all times. So this is a world that gives us a picture of a world so unlike our normal sinful world, which is ruled by fear and is ruled by scarcity, right? We're not going to have enough, and somebody is out to get me. Those are two basic truths that we often live with, whether we even know we're living with them or not. There's not enough, and somebody is going to get me. But this story shows a different view, and that is a view of God's abundance. There is enough with God, and we can live in shalom together. Wow. Faithfulness in all things. And so you can see how, although I can't help but think about refugees, this isn't really about refugees, is it? It's about something even deeper in us, of how we welcome, of how we are hospitable, of how we live out the daily acts of faithfulness. In last week, I shared about how Calvary began with a very simple vision. It wasn't in a vision statement or anything, but it happened because the neighborhood was being built, and so people built this church. A neighborhood existed. People should be able to worship in that neighborhood. What an amazingly simple and yet profound truth. And in many ways, we have just tried to carry that on through the decades, to be faithful to the vision and faithful to the heart of folks like Bud, who has passed away, and Keith Niebuhr, and those other saints who have gone before us and paved the way. And so in some ways, that's what we're seeing in Ruth, right? People are here, they're in front of us, they're loved by God, we will love them as well. So there is a transformative power to simple faithfulness. I heard it this week after we had Bud Meadham's funeral. And during the funeral and at the graveside, I ended up having not one, not two, not three, but 4 or 5 different conversations about Bud. And they all said the same thing. He gave me grace when I was at a low point, and it transformed my life. His granddaughter in particular shared how she had made mistakes in her life, how she had then come to a place of rock bottom, and not just mistakes, but life beating her down. And she came to Dorothy and Bud and lived with them, and maybe even still is, but has been shown grace by them. And she said, I'm not where I need to be, but I am where I am only because they simply opened their home up to me. What an incredible testimony. I don't think Bud and Dorothy are trying to save the world. They're just trying to do something nice for a family member. But how far does that go? God's people are called to be a place of shalom. And there's something that may help us to live this out, to live this life of hospitality and joy and shalom. And it is a simple truth of a fact that you may have missed. There's a story of a refugee, Ruth, who is the main character, but she's not the first one mentioned in this story. The first one mentioned in this story is Naomi, who leaves Bethlehem to go to the country of Moab when there was another famine. And she is welcomed in Moab and plants down and raises a family there. And she then is forced to go back. And to me, that speaks volumes, because this story is not just a story about, oh, poor old Ruth had to go and be rescued by this other country. It is the simple fact that we all need help. We all need God. We all reach bottom at some point. Not just Ruth, but Naomi before her, and everybody before her will come to that place where we are going to need some grace and shalom from a community. And by God's grace, may we find it. And by God's grace, may we be that place. Let's pray. God, thank you for giving Calvary a vision and for giving us your Son. God, in this story, you're barely mentioned, and there's no miracle. And so what does this story have to do with you? And yet we see it so clearly. We see how you are bending history toward salvation, toward your ends, toward what you need it to be. And for that we are thankful and ask that you would help us to simply be faithful with what is right in front of us, to love the people right next to us. In your name, amen.